Hi, my name is Greg Watson. I'm recording this as my final project for FMS360. It's a science fiction film course through Arizona State University. And today I'm going to be taking a look at 1993's Demolition Man and making a case for it as a purely science fiction film that has action in it rather than an action film with science fiction elements. And the way that we're going to do that is taking a look at a number of conventions that kind of define what a science fiction film is. Start, lay out some basic facts about the film itself. Directed by Marco Brambilla, released in 1993. Three different writers: Peter Lenkov, Robert Renault, Daniel Waters, and starring Sylvester Stallone as the protagonist, John Spartan, Wesley Snipes as the antagonist, Simon Phoenix, and the other top-billed cast of Sandra Bullock, Dennis Leary, and Benjamin Bratt. Home movie starts in 1993 when both Sylvester Stallone and Wesley Snipes. Sylvester Stallone is a law enforcement officer in Los Angeles chasing down his nemesis. Um, a fight ensues, and John Spartan, Sylvester Stallone's character, is falsely accused of working with Simon Phoenix in a way to where they are both sentenced to a newly developed form of sentencing, of prison time, cryostasis, in which the individuals are frozen cryogenically and just kind of locked up for X amount of decades. What ends up happening is in 2032, Simon Phoenix ends up escaping prison during a de-thawed parole hearing, and he begins wreaking havoc on this new version of Los Angeles, now called San Angeles, as it has enveloped and become a larger metropolis of multiple Southern California cities and counties. But Simon Phoenix is kind of wreaking all of this havoc and causing chaos and killing it at a whim. And the only way that the present day 2032 law enforcement think that they're going to be able to stop this man is to get the person that stopped him in the first place and thought him out, John Spartan. So the entire story is kind of about these two, quote, old school villains, or old school characters rather, the hero and the villain, being sort of fish out of water in this futuristic society, and seeing how those types of things clash are the cultural ideologies of the 1990s versus what they might be like in 2032. So, of course, the question is it really science fiction? Is it a science fiction film with some action, or is it an action film with some weak science fiction elements? And the way that we're kind of going to examine this are through two lenses. The first one is through Theodore Dalrymple's ideas of, a dystopia and a utopia, and how those both end up getting examined within a cultural ideology, which means we're going to take a look at, what we think a utopia would look like, what what that would all entail, and what that dystopia would end up being like, and our pros and cons in that aspect. Now, secondly, we're also going to be taking a look, and this will come back towards the conclusion, but once we go through the whole process. But Vivian Sobchak's definition of science fiction being not just that fantasizing about the future. Oh, it'd be super cool if we had flying cars, but hypothesizing exactly how that future were to come about, using the literal scientific method of creating that hypothesis, and then through a narrative exploration or experimentation, if you will, seeing exactly what types of results would happen in that designed narrative, to end up getting to that result based on the hypothesis. So it is very much that scientific method applied to a fictional narrative. To start, we're going to take a look at some metaphors, allegories, and ideologies that the film contains, that kind of reflect those conventions that are used in science fiction a lot. There are a lot of metaphors in science fiction. There has to be to get the meaning of the narrative down. Uh, so in the film, there is this history that kind of gets explained through exposition, and through that exposition, it is revealed that at some point between 1993 and 2032, there was this huge franchise war um, in which Taco Bell, of all franchises, became the number one monopolistic owner of all food service within San Angeles, the fictional city. That means that going to Taco Bell was this great event and great honor to be able to get invited to go out to Taco Bell because it was the restaurant. Um, in 1993, it kind of was more of a tongue-in-cheek joke, but in the 90s, conglomeration was well on its way. It had existed for a while as more and more companies began to buy each other up and eat each other up into these large conglomerations. And between 1993 and our present day 2022, we've kind of seen that happen, especially in the media industry. Disney in particular, the amount of separate corporations, of competitive corporations that Disney has bought up underneath its mantle is really astounding. And this idea of franchise wars and conglomeration are no longer, as much of a tongue-in-cheek joke as almost an inevitability to where we will see Disney continue on. It doesn't really have a reason to ever stop growing its conglomeration to where in the near future we may very well see a huge ownership of our entire cultural identity owned by Disney.
And much like metaphors, science fiction generally involves examining or exploring a lot of different types of ideologies. Those are, um, philosophical, political, existential, all types of different ideologies in a lot of different ways. But especially with American science fiction, one of the most pertinent and long-standing ideologies that we have is this idea of our political leanings. Um, and it's been that way since the beginning of the birth of our country. Um, and in all of those political leanings, when we take something like Demolition Man and launch it into the future to see how those things end up happening, or how those things end up growing or evolving or changing, uh, we see essentially exactly what San Angeles has become, this totalitarian utopia. Utopia for those citizens living in San Angeles and adhering to the rules put in place by their leader, Dr. Cocteau, uh, and just living their lives. But from the outside looking in, or a group of dissidents living underground, that is not a utopia by any means, but more of a dystopia where people are policed on their language, sex is policed and outlawed, procreation is essentially has become a form of eugenics. We'll talk about that in a little while. But on the one hand, you have this totalitarian utopia or dystopia, and on the left hand side, you have this anarchist, genocidal, homicidal maniac in Simon Phoenix, bringing in his ideology of complete chaos. So you have these two extremes of complete control and complete anarchy. And when faced with both of those extremes, the writers actually suggest what could be considered a form of libertarianism. And depending on who you ask, libertarianism in and of itself could turn a lot of people off. But when faced with those two extremes, all of a sudden, the ideology of libertarianism doesn't sound so wild anymore. And I believe a lot of people who, would normally not lean that way when faced with these two extremes may actually be more agreeable to a lot of the libertarian ideologies. So this is kind of summed up. The dissidents underground, their leader explains exactly how he feels about everything and what he wants the world to be like. So let's take a look at that real quick.
See, according to Cocteau's plan, I'm the enemy. Because I like to think. I like to read. I'm into freedom of speech and freedom of choice. I'm the kind of guy that likes to sit in a greasy spoon and wonder, gee, should I have the T-bone steak or the jumbo rack of barbecue ribs with the side order gravy fries? I want high cholesterol. I want to eat bacon and butter and buckets of cheese, okay? I want to smoke a Cuban cigar the size of Cincinnati in the non-smoking section. I want to run through the streets naked with green jello all over my body reading Playboy magazine. Why? Because I suddenly might feel the need to, okay, pal? I've seen the future. You know what it is? It's a 47-year-old virgin sitting around in his beige pajamas drinking a banana broccoli shake singing, I'm an Oscar Mayer wiener.
Speaking of dystopias and utopias and kind of the mix of the two, depending on your point of perspective, one thing that science fiction is also very good at is using allegories, and Demolition Man kind of takes an allegory, creates an allegory of an allegory, right? So there are a number of different parallels that can be drawn between George Orwell's 1984 and Demolition Man in 1993, or 2032, as far as the year that it exists or takes place. That leader that I talked about that was voted in to take over and develop all the laws and outlaw all of these things and all of that. His name was Dr. Cocteau, who ends up becoming a stand-in for Big Brother as he was in 1984, who was in turn a stand-in for Stalin, or Joseph Stalin. That city of San Angeles, that big metropolitan utopia or dystopia, is a one for one with Airstrip One. But like most utopias or dystopias, there is a caste system. And I mentioned the dissidents living underground. We'll talk about that in a little while. But in this particular movie, the caste system is more H.G. Wells than Orwell. And that might sound confusing at the moment, but I'll lean into it a little more in just a minute. But one of the more interesting ways that Demolition Man still remains an allegory for 1984, but kind of changes the narrative a little bit, is how they managed to outlaw sex. And it wasn't necessarily because of that human interaction and how emotions arose in 1984, as much as it was for pathogen and contagion control and avoidance, to make sure that sicknesses and illnesses weren't being transmitted, being, you know, shared amongst citizens. So, um, with the way that we in the United States have been experiencing a deadly pathogen, and all of these new 6 feet rules and no contact rules and no social gathering rules, it's very interesting to see how that scientific method that the writers created explored that and kind of took it to the extreme of what could happen. But let's take a look at this clip of them explaining exactly how and why sex became outlawed, and see if we can't draw some parallels to the fear and paranoia surrounding uh, the contagion that was COVID, or that is COVID-19, and how scary it is for people.
What's wrong? You broke contact.
Contact? I didn't touch it yet.
But I thought you wanted to make love.
Is that what you call this?
First sex has been proven to produce higher orders of alpha waves during digitized transference of sexual energies.
All right, Huxley, what do you say we just do it the old-fashioned way?
Ew, disgusting. You mean fluid transfer?
I mean, boning, or the wild mambo, the hunka-chunka.
That is no longer done. The exchange of bodily fluids, do you know what that leads to?
Yeah, I do. Kids, smoking, a desire to raid the fridge.
The rampant exchange of bodily fluids was one of the major reasons for the downfall of society. After AIDS, there was NRS. After NRS, there was UBT. And one of the first things that Dr. Cocteau was able to do was to outlaw and behaviorally engineer all fluid transfer out of societally acceptable behavior. Not even mouth transfer is condoned.
Kissing's not allowed? Ugh. Damn, I was a good kisser.
Oh.
All right, then what about kids?
Procreation?
Yeah.
We go to a lab. Fluids fluids are purified, screened, and transferred by authorized medical personnel only. It is the only legal way.
So it's interesting to kind of use that clip of him talking with, Lieutenant Huxley, played by Sandra Bullock, in the sense that she's, of course, very knowledgeable, incredibly intelligent on the history of San Angeles up to that point. Out of fear, out of interest, whatever it might be, she's wildly intelligent, and she has her own place inside of this fictional world where she is independent, she's powerful in her own way, she's unique, and unfortunately, that trope is very prevalent in science fiction films. If you see these other four female leads in some recent films, well, relatively recent, I know The Fifth Element down there at the bottom right was also in the 90s, but relatively recent, you have 3 out of the 5 of these characters who are wildly powerful and intelligent. Like the 3 out of 5 of them are sentient AIs who are thinking and feeling and existing, but with the processing power of artificial intelligence. They're wildly intelligent. They're extremely independent. They don't, realistically speaking, they don't need anything to help them along their own journeys. However, Sandra Bullock's character and Lulu Dallas, they're not AIs, but they are, in their own way, more intelligent than their, normally, I mean, in these very specific cases, absolutely, but just females in general, they are more remarkable than their normally white, heteronormative male counterpart, who is generally the protagonist and main focus of the film. So, with all of their intelligence, with all of their power, with all of their uniqueness and their identities, they all get set to the wayside through sexual inevitability because they always take that back seat to, as you can see in these photos, their white heteronormative male counterpart. All of those things that make them unique end up taking a back seat to their dependence on that male character. And that's something that we've seen time and time again, not only in science fiction, but just in film and television in general. It's just very, very prevalent in science fiction because they go out of their way to make these very powerful females, these very unique and intelligent females, end up needing this unremarkable man, comparatively speaking, this unremarkable man to help them along in their life journey. Along with, gender issues, another thing that is incredibly problematic, not just in science fiction film, but in American film and television in general, is African American representation. And unfortunately, this film falls into a lot of the same problematic things that a lot of science fiction does, and it does it as poorly as it handles their female lead. Um, there are 2 primary African American actors in this film. One, of course, is Wesley Snipes, the antagonist. Like I said, homicidal, genocidal sociopath. He kills people for fun. He has a great time just causing chaos everywhere he goes. So he falls into that stereotypical thug definition of an African American male in film and television. That zero redeeming qualities, a scourge on any society that he's in, and is all out for himself, not intelligent. All of those types of things that you can find listed under the definition of thug when it comes to black stereotypes in film and television. However, the only other African American man in this film with any relevant dialogue or any purpose to the narrative is the man on the right, Mr. Bill Cobbs. His character actually was living and worked with John Spartan in 1993. He worked with that protagonist, so he knows the rough and tumble 90s action hero, you know, shoot first, ask questions later type of lifestyle. So he grew into this San Angeles. And as Simon Phoenix starts tearing through San Angeles, it's actually Bill Cobb here to the right who takes on the role of the stereotypical, what is called the magical Negro. And normally, there is some level of actual supernatural ability. If you look up any kind of definition regarding the magical Negro in film and television, or in American film and television, there is that supernatural element. However, I would argue that because San Angeles has moved on so far into that future utopian uh, society, when Bill Cobb here suggests that Sylvester Stallone is thought out to come help find and track down Simon Phoenix and bring him back to justice, his outside the box thinking does almost take on a magical property to it because it is so wildly different than anybody else in that precinct would have been able to think of. So once Bill Cobb fills that role of the magical Negro and helps his white counterparts in the film solve a problem they wouldn't have otherwise been able to solve, his purpose has been served, and his character ultimately takes uh, a backseat and isn't really seen from again for the remainder of the film. Now, going back to that idea of class division, though, talked about a little bit during that 1984 to 2032 allegory, the film towards George Orwell's novel 1984. There's another thing that comes along with that in talking about how this utopian, idealistic society really is, from the outside looking in, a totalitarian dystopia. And the people living underground would absolutely agree with that, most likely. However, we see those libertarian, quote, terrorists or criminals or whatever, living on their own under the streets and all of those types of things. There's another allegory or parallel to be drawn, and that's to H.G. Wells and the Time Machine, who also predicts way further into the future than just a couple decades like this film. But you end up getting the same type of class division and an odd sort of symbiotic relationship where in the Time Machine, the race living above ground in this very hedonistic utopian existence where they're very happy and all of these types of things, the Eloi, they live above ground. And underneath them, though, in those subterranean tunnels, there are these hideous monster-like race of devolved humans called the Morlocks. And the way that they end up existing is the Morlocks will come up at night and snatch a couple of Eloys for food. And that's kind of their whole existence, is this cycle, this day-night cycle of the Eloi and the Morlocks. And we actually see this parallel drawn in Demolition Man between the criminals underneath the city and those living above. And there's actually a scene in the film itself where we see the subterranean individuals come up to the surface at night, specifically to steal food from the Taco Bell that John Spartan is eating at. Of course, with science fiction films, there's always that futuristic idea. What if cars were gonna fly and things like that. So Demolition Man does kind of explore a number of different futuristic techs, law enforcement without the need for real physical violence or to prevent or deter physical violence. They don't use firearms. They use electric stun batons. But one of the interesting things is, if we take a look over at these cars on the right, that car on the top was designed in 1993 as what they thought a future car would look like. It is electronic, it is self-driving, and if you look below that, there is a Tesla, which just so happens to look almost identical. That's not to say that Demolition Man influenced Tesla's design by any means. However, it is just an interesting thing to note the similarities there between 1993's imagination of what tech would be like versus what it is. If you look at this image on the left here with Wesley Snipes, without context, it kind of just looks like a picture of him. However, in this scene there explaining how as he is being cryogenically frozen throughout his sentence, he will be essentially reprogrammed subliminally or subconsciously to kind of learn new skills and forget old skills or desires. So when he's thawed out, he can be a more productive member of society. That means that those individuals who are frozen are, taught specific productive skills such as being a seamstress or a waiter or a locksmith, whatever it might be. There's a subtle form of eugenics happening. Not to mention the form of eugenics talked about in that video with Sandra Bullock, where she very clearly defines eugenics as what is being taken place or what is taking place in 2032, where samples are purified and monitored and evaluated before anybody can procreate, which can almost go back to that sense of how there are only two noticeable African Americans in this film. There are a couple extras here and there, but if you get that notion of eugenics taking place and the lack of real diversity throughout the cast, it brings on a new understanding or a new eyebrow raising moment of clarity when we think about exactly where this future goes, like where this future has gone.
And to kind of wrap everything up, the last part we're supposed to talk about is how our selected film made its mark within the genre, made its mark on American culture, and it's kind of difficult to describe with Demolition Man because upon its release, it wasn't necessarily critically acclaimed or positively received at a wide level. There were those action film fans who came to see it. There were Sylvester Stallone fans that came to see it and Wesley Snipes fans that came to see it, but it didn't really have a lasting impact because so many people saw it as an action movie with some bells and whistles to make it, stand out as this futuristic action movie rather than a science fiction film with that action element in it. Um, but the what makes Demolition Man really special is even though it wasn't able to have that impact on the science fiction genre or really affect any kind of like change or anything in American culture, the effectiveness in which the writers were able to use that scientific method and create a fictional narrative and end up lining so many predictions up to our existence and our real time 2022 day-to-day living has been eerie at some points. So we talked about the electric cars, we talked about the transhumanism, um, but one of the last things that I will leave with you is the three seashells. The three seashells is a running joke inside of the film in which John Spartan, he gets thawed out and he tries to use the restroom. He comes out and he tells people, he's like, hey, you're out of toilet paper, and where there should be toilet paper there's these three seashells on a little shelf. And he's chided, and they laugh at him and they explain, like, oh yeah, toilet paper, they used to use wads of toilet paper to clean themselves, and it was very barbaric and all those things. And in 1993 that's sounded preposterous. Like, how could toilet paper ever, not be a thing? These three seashells that we don't even get to see on screen, let alone understand how they're used as a sanitary device. But this idea that a society would have moved beyond toilet paper for any reason just seemed really weird at the time in 1993. But then all of a sudden, COVID-19 comes around, and we'll take a look at this quick clip to get an idea of exactly how that might have come about. Now, while that news source was talking about Australia, that was a global phenomenon in which all of a sudden toilet paper became this incredibly in demand and scarce resource because of the people just buying it and hoarding it up. And then all of a sudden, um, it's not so far fetched to think that if that had continued on, there would have been a vacuum created in which somebody would have had to have come up with some new form of sanitation that wasn't reliant on toilet paper anymore. So again, I think I want to just leave you all with this idea that Demolition Man is an incredible science fiction film, and it only continues to become more and more interesting as we see just how accurate a lot of their predictions were through using that scientific method that we talked about, um, through that lens of Vivian Sobchak. But hopefully, if you were on the action film side of the house, managed to kind of move that a little towards that idea that Demolition Man is a great science fiction film. But I'll share with you a couple of slides of references that I used, a lot of the images and links and stuff like that. But thank you, and I hope you enjoyed.